Dr. NightEchoes.
We were stationed near an active front in Ukraine. The stress was high, and we weren't sleeping much because of the shelling. One night, during a lull in the noise, I was looking through a pair of high-end night vision goggles. Out in the middle of a field that had been chewed up by artillery, I saw a group of figures. They weren't wearing gear. They looked like tall, thin smears of black ink against the green glow of the goggles. They weren't running or taking cover. They were just gliding across the mud. I pointed them out to my squad mate, but he couldn't see them with his eyes. When he took my goggles, he turned pale. He said they didn't have shadows. We watched them walk right through a burnt-out tank like it was made of smoke. As they got closer to our trench, the air started to feel heavy, like right before a massive thunderstorm. One of them stopped and looked directly at our position. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed by a cold hand. It didn't do anything else. It just stood there while the others kept moving toward the enemy lines. The next morning, we found out that the entire unit in that direction had been found dead in their sleep. There were no marks on them, no signs of a struggle. I still have the goggles. Sometimes I turn them on in my house at night. I usually turn them back off before I can see anything. I was working late in the motor pool, trying to fix a leak on a Humvee. It was just me and one other guy, Peterson, who was working on the far side of the lot. I saw someone in OCPs crawl under the truck parked right next to mine. I figured it was Peterson, looking for a dropped bolt or something. I saw his boots sticking out from under the chassis. I called out and asked if he had an extra 10mm socket, but he didn't answer. He just kicked his legs a little bit. I walked over to the side of the truck and leaned down to look under. It wasn't Peterson. It was a man, or it looked like one at first, but his arms were way too long. His elbows were tucked up against the frame of the truck, and his skin looked like wet gray paper. He was holding a wrench, but his fingers were wrapped around it 3 or 4 times like they were made of rubber. He turned his head toward me, and his eyes were wide and very blue, like a normal person's. He didn't look angry. He just looked surprised that I was looking at him. He made a soft clicking sound in the back of his throat and then pulled himself up into the engine block in a way that should have been physically impossible. There was no space for a body in there. I scrambled back and ran to find Peterson. He was in the break room eating a sandwich and said he hadn't been outside for an hour. We went back with flashlights, but the truck was empty. The wrench was still sitting on the concrete. It was bent into a perfect circle. We were out at Bridgeport for winter training, just doing a standard night hike to get used to the gear and the snow. It was incredibly quiet, the kind of cold that makes your ears ring. I was walking near the back of the line with Miller. About 20 minutes in, I started hearing someone whistling. It was a very specific tune, like an old cartoon song, coming from maybe 30 yards ahead in the trees. I thought it was Davis because he always whistled that same annoying melody back at the base. It sounded perfectly human, just a bit thin because of the wind. I leaned over to Miller and told him to go tell Davis to shut up before the sergeant heard him. Miller looked at me funny and pointed right next to us. Davis was walking 2 feet away from me. He had his gaiter pulled up over his face, and his hands were busy adjusting his pack straps. He wasn't making a sound. I stopped walking for a second, and the whistling ahead of us stopped, too. It didn't fade out. It just cut off mid-note, like a recording being paused. I asked Davis if he had been whistling, and he just shook his head, looking tired. We stood there for a minute, and I looked into the tree line. There were no tracks in the fresh snow except for ours. The whistling started up again, but this time it was coming from behind us, exactly where we had just walked. It was the same tune, but it sounded faster now, almost frantic. We didn't tell the sergeant. We just moved closer together and kept our heads down. I still hear that tune in my head when I'm in quiet rooms. I don't go into the woods anymore, even during the day. During a training exercise in a heavy jungle environment, we came across a small cave opening that wasn't on our recon brief. An old man was sitting outside on a flat rock. He looked local, but his clothes were from a different era, very ragged and gray. He didn't speak English, but he kept pointing at the trees and making a snapping motion with his fingers. He looked terrified. Our sergeant told us to ignore him and keep moving. As we walked away, I looked back, and the man was gone. There was no way he could have moved that fast. That night, we set up a perimeter. Around midnight, we heard a snap from above us. It sounded like a heavy branch breaking. One of our guys, Henderson, just vanished. There was no scream, just the sound of something heavy being dragged up into the canopy. When we shined our lights up, we just saw the leaves shaking. We found his helmet the next morning. It was tucked neatly inside a hollow log 50 feet up. It didn't have any blood on it. The plastic was melted in the shape of a large handprint. We never found the rest of him. The locals in the nearby village wouldn't even look at us when we asked about the old man or the cave. They just closed their doors. I still have dreams about that snapping sound. Every time I hear a branch break in the wind, I look up. I was on guard duty at a small outpost near the edge of the forest. It was around 2 a.m., and I was using the thermals to scan the brush. I saw a heat signature about 50 yards out. It looked like a large deer, maybe an elk. It was just standing there, which is normal, so I didn't think much of it. Then the thing stood up on its back legs. It didn't do it like a normal animal struggling for balance. It just straightened its spine and stayed there, perfectly still. I adjusted the focus, thinking the gear was glitching. Through the headset, I started hearing a scratching sound, like radio static. It wasn't coming from the comms. It was coming from the direction of the tree. The deer opened its mouth, and I heard my own voice come out of it. It said, "Post 1, all clear," which is exactly what I had said over the radio 10 minutes earlier. The voice was flat and tinny, like it was being played through a broken speaker. The deer started walking toward the fence, still on 2 legs. It jerked its head in a way that looked like its neck was broken. It kept repeating my name over and over, getting louder and more distorted each time. I didn't fire because I was shaking too hard to move my hands. It stopped just outside the light of the perimeter and just stared at me. Its eyes didn't reflect the light like an animal's should. They just looked like 2 holes. I quit the service 3 months later. I can't stand being around dogs or even cattle now. I always feel like they're about to start talking. I worked private security for a facility that officially didn't exist, located about 2 hours out into the desert. My job was just to watch the monitors in a small room on level 4. Most of the time, it was just empty hallways and crates. One night, a transport team brought in a large glass container. It wasn't filled with liquid. It was filled with a thick, yellow gas. Inside the gas, I could see something moving. It looked like a human rib cage, but it was made of shiny black plastic and wires. It was pulsing, like it was breathing. There were no organs, just the frame. As they pushed the cart past the camera, the thing pressed a hand against the glass. The hand was just 3 long metal needles covered in thin, transparent skin. It didn't look like a robot. It looked like something that had been grown in a lab and then forced into a machine. The tech pushing the cart looked at the camera and shook his head, like he was telling me to forget I saw it. The feed went to static for 3 seconds. When it came back, the hallway was empty. I was reassigned the next day to a surface gate. I never asked questions, but I started noticing the same yellow tint in the clouds over the desert every Thursday. I moved to the East Coast last year. I still check the vents in my apartment every night before I go to bed. My grandfather left a journal from his time in Germany near the end of the war. He wrote about a village they found that wasn't on any of the Allied maps. They marched into it around noon, but he said the sky was a weird, bruised purple color that never changed. The houses were all intact, but there was no dust on anything, and no people. He said they found a basement in the town square filled with heavy iron crates. One of the crates was cracked open. Inside wasn't gold or documents, but a set of stone teeth and a heavy copper bowl that seemed to hum. When his sergeant touched the bowl, the sound stopped, and the whole village felt like it shifted. My grandfather said he looked out the window and saw his own unit marching into the town again, exactly as they had done 10 minutes before. He saw himself in the line. They tried to leave, but every road they took just led them back to the town square. They were stuck there for what felt like days, but their watches never moved a single second. Eventually, they just ran through a forest until they hit a main road. When they found another unit, they were told they had only been missing for 20 minutes. My grandfather never threw away that journal, but he ripped out the last few pages. He told my dad that sometimes, when he looked in a mirror, he saw the version of himself that stayed in that village. He died thinking he was still there. We were doing a land nav course at Fort McCoy. It was a simple 4-point trek through some light brush. My partner and I started at 0800. We hit the first 3 points fine, but then we entered a small gully that felt unusually warm. We walked for maybe 10 minutes, topped a small ridge, and found ourselves back at the start point. We thought we had just messed up the compass reading. We looked at our watches, and they said it was 0815. We felt fine, just a little thirsty. But when we looked at our gear, things were wrong. The nylon straps on my ruck were frayed and faded, like they had been sitting in the sun for 10 years. My partner's boots, which were brand new that morning, had the soles completely worn down to the foam. His rifle was covered in a thick layer of rust that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. We went to the CO, and he was furious. He told us we had been gone for 6 hours, and they were about to call a search party. We tried to explain the time on our watches, but he didn't want to hear it. My partner ended up getting a skin infection a few days later. The doctor said it looked like something you only see in people who have been living in the woods for months without washing. We only walked for 15 minutes. I still can't get the smell of old, wet metal out of my nose.